What's going on, guys? So a lot of you know that I've been taking it kind of slow on YouTube lately just due to some physical issues that I've been having and just because I have some other stuff that I need to get done. And I want the content to keep coming, so we're going to have a guest video today from a developer named Mitchell. He actually runs his own YouTube channel called Techbase. I'll have the link to that in the description. And he also worked on a React Firebase project with me for an upcoming course. And what he's going to do today is a React testing crash course, which I think is a good addition to the channel because I haven't done much testing content. So he's going to get into things like the React testing library, Jest, and some other technologies, and just kind of give you an overall idea of why you should test your applications and so on. All right, so I'll let Mitchell take it from here, and hopefully you guys enjoy it.
Thank you so much, Brad, for the introduction. And hey, everyone, welcome to this React testing crash course. At the end of this video, you will have a good understanding of how to test React apps in an efficient and effective way using the most modern testing tools out there. So in this video, we will go over 5 things: why you should test, what to test, how to write unit, integration, and end-to-end tests. And for that, we're going to use the React testing library and Cypress. So let's get into it. So the goal of testing is to check whether an application behaves as expected. The idea is that it will safeguard you against unwanted behavior like bugs when you are changing the code. And this could be, for example, when you are adding new features, refactor the code, update the app dependencies, and so on. This will give you a lot of confidence when creating projects for either yourself or your clients, because by writing those automated tests, you can very quickly check if your app is still working fine without having to manually test the app, which is, especially for large apps, very time consuming. So as I said before, testing is all about testing the behavior of your application. So that's why it's important to have a test priority, because testing simply takes time and thus costs money. Compared to cleaning your car, you probably don't have the time to clean every nook and cranny, but you rather focus on the windows, the outside of the car body, and the rims. The same goes for testing. You probably don't have time to test everything, so that's why you need a proper test priority. Now, is there like a golden rule when it comes down to test priority in React? No, but the following list has worked very well for me and seems to be in line with what most people in the testing community would agree on. So first, we will go through the list and then put it into context by using a real-world React demo app. High-value features are the ones that bring most value or money to an app. Think about Amazon. The most important thing right there is to actually be able to view the products and purchase them. Think about an app like Spotify, where playing music and also making purchases is probably the most important thing. And when it comes down to an app like Gmail, you probably want that users can simply read and send emails. And all those apps often also have other features like changing the profile data or maybe switching from dark to light mode. However, even though you want those things to work as well, they're definitely not the most important features. And in those high value features, you'll want to focus on the happy paths. So just following the correct steps to complete the feature successfully. So when testing for the edge cases in your high value features, you want to rather focus on the sad paths, right? So this could, for example, be if you have an e-commerce shop where you have a store-wide rule that you cannot order more than 100 products. So you want to test, for example, what happens if a user tries to add 1,000 items, right? Is he actually able to do that? Or will we receive an error message? Something like that. The third point is to test for things that can easily break, right? Maybe you've been working on an application and you have just seen that, over a certain period of time, certain features just were breaking every now and then. Even though you were able to make fixes for them, you just feel that it's a sensitive, a very easily breakable part in your application. And of course, it's easy to say, well, then you should solve it. But some applications simply do have like these sensitive parts. So you also want to write tests for those. And then you have what I would call basic React component testing. So here you want to focus on the most important ones first. So for example, the components that are used in your high value features, or maybe just ones that are used very often throughout your code base. And in those components, you will roughly find 3 things to test. User interaction, so that could be, for example, on-click or on-change events. Conditional rendering, which could, for example, be state changes, right? So maybe changes in the props or in the use state, or in maybe some context you set up, or even something like Redux. and utils and hooks. So that could be just simply functions that you use throughout certain components, or simply custom hooks you created yourself. On the other hand, you don't want to waste your time testing so-called implementation details. So what a lot of developers did back in the days is that they were testing, for example, that after a mutation, the use state hook, the value of the use state hook would, for example, change. The problem there is that it's not a reliable way of testing your React app, and is also not resembling how users actually use your application. But don't worry too much about it, because at the end of this course, you'll have a good idea of how to write proper tests while avoiding these bad testing practices. So let's set up the React demo app. So you will find a link down below to a GitHub starter repo, which I have right here. Of course, you can simply clone this repo by using SSH. I'm just going to download it as a zip. So there we go. And I will copy this folder over to one of my folders right here to keep things organized. So now we'll close this up and I will check if it's in there. There we go. I will cd into that folder and I will just restart my code editor. And now you will see we'll have all the files from the repo. Now I'd like to ask you to open up your terminal. I'll just make sure you can see it as well. And I'd like to ask you to run the following command: yarn install and yarn dev. And if you don't have yarn installed, you can install it by saying npm install globally yarn. But since I have it installed, I can just continue and saying yarn install and yarn dev, and I'll get back to you once it's installed. All right, so here it is, the demo app. If it did not work for you, you might try to just get out of your terminal, like start a new one and run the command yarn dev again. That most of the time get rid of most errors. What you probably will also notice is that my app looks different than yours because I have an extension called Dark Reader. I have it enabled, so that's why it looks like I have dark mode enabled. So let's take a quick look to what the app has to offer. So first of all, I will click on logout, and now you can log in with the username John Doe, and the password is secret, but the first E is a 3. So we'll just copy and paste this, click remember me, sign in, and there we go. So what you see right here, this is a banking application, and right here you can see payments of friends and yourself, of course. There's an account page where you can change account details. There are some bank accounts you can create. You have your notifications, and of course you can also make new payments. So for a relatively small app like this, you can easily, write a couple of tests and you will pretty much have everything tested. But I'd like to show you how we can test this app according to the testing priority list I just showed you, and how you could go from there. So when it comes down to high value features, there are, in an app like this, 2 things that stand out to me. The first most important thing is that you want to check your account balance and your transactions, and you also want to be able to make a payment to someone else. Obviously, there are more important features, but in this crash course, we're going to focus on those 2 as being the high value features. The second item on the list are testing the edge cases and the high value features. So in this app, it could, for example, be to check whether a user is able to submit this form by actually not putting in an amount and a note, and thus receiving an error message. The third thing on the list are things that are sensitive to break. Now, of course, not every application has those, and since I'm not aware of any sensitive part in this application, and you're probably not as well, we'll just skip that one for this course. And then we come to React component testing, and since this second part of the form is such an important part of the application, and this is actually one component, I think it makes it a great use case for testing that as well. So we are really close now to writing the actual code, but before we do that, I'd like to talk about the fact that in this course we're going to focus on the 3 most common types of tests in automated testing, which are unit tests, integration tests, and end-to-end tests. Unit testing is about testing a very small part of the code, especially in functional programming. Mostly we refer to testing a function. integration testing is testing essentially whether multiple units in your applications are working correctly together. So essentially you're combining unit tests into one larger test. And last but not least, you have end-to-end tests, which is all about testing from the one end, the front end, all the way to the back end. So that is really similar to actually mimicking how a user would use your application in the browser, but you will find more about that later on. Especially if you have never heard about these different kind of tests before, it doesn't really matter, but it might be hard to understand. So that's why at the end of this video, in the wrap up, we will go over this once again, and it will be much easier for you to put things into context. So what might surprise you is that we're going to write tests from the bottom and up. And the reason for that, because usually you want to start at the top of the list, is that the tests we're going to write at the bottom of the list are more, they're more concise, they're easier to understand. So through time, we're going to increase the difficulty of every test we're writing. So we are going to start by writing 2 unit tests, and we're going to focus on step 2 of the payment process. And for this, we're going to use the React testing library, which as of today comes with, by default, with a create React app installation. So it's already installed in this repo. So let's try to find out how this component is actually called. So what I often do is I just search based on the text I see. So right here, see, please enter a valid amount, the error message. So I can just copy it, go over right here, and now you will see that that component is called transaction create step 2. So we don't really have to worry what's inside this component. I'm just going to copy the name of the component, and I will create a new file, and I will name it just like the component itself, but I will say instead of tsx, I will say test dot, and for this we're just going to use javascript.js. So let's check if by default when we land on this or actually use this component, the pay button is disabled. So I will say test, and right here I will give it a name. So I could say on initial render, the pay button is disabled. And then I'll put in an arrow function. And then right here, the first thing I have to do is I have to render this component. So I will say render, and I will import that from testing library React. And I will render the transaction create step 2 component. As you see, it just auto imported the component. And what we could do now is we could simply say screen, which we also have to import from the React testing library, .debug, which is actually a function. So now when I save this file, and I will just open up a new terminal, and right here I'm going to say yarn test. Just open it up. You see that right now the test is going to run. It might take a bit of time. You'll see that the test now has filled. So when we scroll up, we can see what actually filled, and it says right here, on initial render, the pay button is disabled. So that's the name of our test. And then it says type error, cannot read property ID of undefined. And as you can see right here, sender ID is actually used in that transaction create step 2 component. So when we go to that component, transaction create step 2, and right here, when I scroll up, you'll see that the component expects some props, including the receiver and the sender. So what I can do, I can go right here, and I can actually pass some props here as well, right? We're just simply rendering the component. So I could say sender is, and I could just fake that it gets an idea of, I don't know, just a number, and the other one is, the other prop is receiver. And there I could say that the ID is also just a random string. And now when I save this, and I scroll all the way down again, you will now see that the test has passed. And this is really important to know, because if you don't make any assertions in your test, which we will do in a couple of minutes from now, your test will automatically pass, unless there are errors, of course. So you might wonder, what's up with the screen.debug. Now, if we scroll up, you will see right here that we have a console log, which is essentially console logging the body. So this is essentially the HTML that React testing library was able to find. And right here, you can, for example, see the input element with the amount. Now, I'd like to show you another example of how we can show the roles that are in this document. And you will see that this input, for example, is one of them. So instead of saying screen.debug, I will now say get screen.get by role, and just an empty string right here. Now when I save it and go back to my test, you will see we again have a failing test. So when I scroll up, you'll see right here that unable to find an accessible element with the role empty string. But what's nice about this command is that we're able to see what roles are available in this element. So you can see we have a heading, we have a text box, including the amount and the description, like the add a note, and then we have the buttons. And that's exactly what we want to focus on, right? We want to check whether this button is disabled by default. So keep in mind that this button has a name, so we can very easily target it in our test. So I will remove this and I will put the first assertion right here. So we'll say expect screen.get by role. And we want to look for a button. And now we want to specifically target that pay button. So that's why you saw the name in the empty get by role search we just did. And we can target it by putting in an object right here and saying that the name should equal pay. We're going to do a case insensitive search. And then right here, we can say to be enabled instead of disabled. And I will show you in a minute why. So let's save this and run the test. Now, this is a very good use case why you should always do this, because of course we wanted to check if the button was disabled, but even though we put in is enabled or to be enabled, the test still passes. And the reason for that, and this is something you won't find very often in applications, but right here we have some errors, and this is related to forming. Now to get rid of this, because I can also show you this actually, let's go back right here. Now you will see when I click right here on the user, you will see that the payment button will be enabled for just for a fraction of time. But you will see, as you see right there, it goes from like enabled to disabled. And that's what's going wrong right here. So because this form is using forming, that's causing this, well, I couldn't really call it bug, but this behavior we need to use, but this is something you usually don't have to use. We have to use async await right here. So we can say async, and right here we can put await. And instead of saying get by role, because right now if I hover over await, you will see it says has no effect on this type of expression. But that's because if we're using async await, instead of saying get by role, you want to using find by role. So now let's save this and take a look at the outcome of the test. All right, great. So now it says received element is not enabled, and that was what we were looking for, right? And I think it's always a good practice to, if you're making an assertion, first do it the opposite side, right? And then, make it so that the test will pass, just to be sure that there are no, bugs or strange things going on. All right, so now let's switch it back to, instead of being to be enabled, to be disabled. And now you will see when I will save the file and go back to our test, boom. And now you will see it has successfully passed. So that's great. Now let's write another test. I'm actually going to copy this over here. And let's try to test for this button to become, for example, enabled when we're putting in an amount and a note, right? Because that is, as you can see, also a requirement. We also have to put in a note right here. So I will change the name of the test. I will say if an amount and note is entered, the pay button is enabled, or better, becomes enabled. So in this test, we also want to render the transaction create step 2 component with these props, but of course we will not need this assertion, so I'll just remove it. Now, what I want to do, I want to mimic the event where the user is entering an amount and adds a note. And then we want to, of course, do kind of like the same thing, but then expect that the button becomes enabled. Now, before we do that, I'd like to let you know about this. Like in React, with the React testing library, there is a recommended testing priority, and this is with regard to the queries you're doing. So as you can see right here, get by role, that is for most queries the recommended way to go. However, if you're going to target form elements, which this definitely is, your first your preference should be that you try to target that by label text. But unfortunately, this form doesn't use labels for its inputs, right? It's just using a placeholder, and I can show this to you. So I can do screen dot get by role, and we do the empty string thing again. So now when I scroll up, you will see right here that we have a text box, but we do not have a name, so we cannot target it by saying get by role. And well, as you can see, it also does not have a label. So what we then can do, since it uses a placeholder, we can use the following query. We will be using get by placeholder text. So to mimic this user event, we can make use of user event that also comes with React testing library. So I'll say user event, and I have to manually import it. So I'll just copy this line. I'll say user event, and this is not coming from testing library React, but testing library user event. There we go. So right here we want to type, so we'll say type. And then we want to target screen dot get by placeholder text. And then we want to target it by the name. So right here, the placeholder text was amount, right? So we can put amount in here. And then the second argument is the actual string that will be typed. So we can do 50. And I can copy this, and we also want to add a note. So I can say this should target the add a note, and it will pass dinner. And now let's do a screen dot get by role again. Get by role, there we go, empty string. So you could also use something like screen dot debug, but I just like the get by role with the empty string because it shows you, well, in a better structured way, the elements, you could say. So let's wait for this to run. There we go. So now when I scroll up, you will see that right here we have that input, but you will see that right now it has a value of dinner. And when I scroll up a little more, you'll see that our input field now has a value of $50. So the $, of course, is added by the code, obviously. So this is great. So now we can simply copy this line and replace it by the screen dot get by role. And well, we can do the same thing again. So we can first check if it's disabled. And of course, that should not be the case because we now have properly been putting in some data into the form. And this pattern, which you see right here, is often referred to as the arrange, act, assert pattern. So in the first phase of the test, you are arranging things. So for example, rendering the component. Then you have your act. So that could be, user events, typing, clicking, things like that. And then you have your assertions where you're going to, well, make your assertions. So as you can see right here, we got a test result and it says received element is not disabled, which is great because it should actually be enabled. So of course, you can already guess what happens if we will put this in there and save the file. Boom, and there we go. We have 2 passing tests. And as you can see, testing, it's not all that difficult, right? If you have your test priority in place, it's more about translating user interactions in code and making the right assertions. So to quickly recap, right now you learned how to test for user interactions and how to check conditional rendering, because these buttons, or at least right now we tested one button, of course, but that's essentially, conditional rendering taking place, simply whether a button is disabled or not. So next up we have integration tests. And as I said before, integration tests are about testing multiple units of code, which usually results in like one larger test. And you will often find that these type of tests have multiple assertions in them, right? So you often see that, you have your arrange, so you have your rendering of your component, and then you could, for example, have user typing something, you make an assertion, and then the user clicks on something again, you again make a new assertion. So that's most often how this test looks like, because you're, well, like I said before, you are testing multiple units of code together. So it's good to know that not everyone in the community completely agrees on what actually a unit versus an integration test is, right? So you got to keep that in mind, that you might come across people that have different thoughts or ideas about that. In the end of the video, we will wrap things up and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But let's actually write our first integration test. So when writing tests, it's a very good idea to think about realistic user flows. And now looking back at our unit tests, this is not really how a user would use our application, right? If they would land on this page, because, these are essentially very small parts of that specific user flow. But when a user comes here, what probably will happen is, they search for a user, and first they look, they see, the pay button is disabled. So I will, add some data right here. Now it becomes enabled. There we go. And they will click on the pay button, right? That's the most common scenario how users will use this feature. So we can very simply combine these two unit tests into one integration test. And I can show you how. It's very simple. I will take this line right here. I will put it in this test. I will remove this test from here. And, I can leave the name of the test just like this. And now when I will save this, you will see that the test, because right now we will only have one, will pass. And of course, this is a very simple example, but I've often found myself being able to combine, 8 or even more unit tests into one integration test. And especially in this scenario, I would personally prefer it, because it better resembles how a user would use our application. Please keep in mind that integration testing definitely is not about combining unit tests into one test. However, if you find that you are able to combine unit tests into one integration test, right, so that it will resemble a more realistic user flow, I definitely would recommend you to do it. And from a practical point of view, you will often find that just a few unit tests are, much better than, having like hundreds of very small and concise unit tests. Now let's move on to writing end-to-end tests, which are by far my most favorite type of tests, simply for the fact that they are so effective in testing, the things that really matter, your high value features. And it's also really fun to write them, because you can actually see the simulations happening on the screen, which, it's so blazingly fast, like no human could interact with an application that fast. For this, we're going to use a tool called Cypress. However, since it does not come by default with Create React App, we need to set some things up. So we want to install Cypress, and in order to do that, we can say yarn add, and this will be a dev dependency, and we can say Cypress, and we also want to have testing library /Cypress. So I go back to you once that's done. All right, great. So now we can run the command yarn run Cypress open. And this will now open up Cypress. So then you will probably see this thing popping up. And as you can see, it already has added some tests by default. So what I want to do, because I want to remove them, is I will go right here to the Cypress folder. And then right here under integration, you will see that there are 2 folders with tests, but I will just remove those 2 folders just like that. Next up, we want to add the React testing library Cypress commands. However, this is completely optional, but I like it because we can then use the same commands we used in the previous test in our Cypress test, which by default is not supported. So I will go to support commands.js, and right here I will add the following line. I will say import add testing library Cypress / add commands. And I'll save that file. So let's close up all these files. And now we'll go to the Cypress folder right here. And under integration, I will create a new file. I will call it payment_spec.js. And we can start writing a test by saying describe. And I'll give it a name. I'll just call it payment. And we have our arrow function. And now right here, we can write the actual test itself. So we can say it. So that's, instead of test, we will say it, just like we did with the React testing library. And then I will say user can make payment. And we have our arrow function right here. So the first thing I generally like to do is to plan the test, right? So what are we actually going to do? So, well, we're going to go through that payment flow, but the first thing a user should do is log in, obviously, right? So the first step will be the login. And then, well, let's do that actually. John Doe, secret. Okay. And then, well, the user probably before he or she is going to make a payment is going to check the account balance, right? So let's say check account balance. So next up, we will then click, or the user will click on the pay button, right? So click on pay button. And then we'll look for a user. So for example, type and click. So search for user. And then, well, the user will enter an amount and add a note. So add amount and note and click pay. Then the user is probably going to check or going to return to the transactions. So click return to transactions. And then, well, the user could, for example, go to the personal tab. So go to the personal payments. Then it's going, for example, clicks on the payment. So click on payment. And then the user is likely going to verify whether the correct payment was made, right? So verify if payment was made. And the user will probably also check the account balance to check if the right amount has been deducted. So verify if payment amount was deducted. What I can highly recommend you is to install the following Chrome extension, which is called Testing Playground. It's made by someone that's very actively, like an active maintainer in the React testing library community. And what this tool allows you to do is it allows you to hover over elements on the page and suggest a query, which is really great. Again, it's optional, but I'm going to use it and I recommend you to use it as well. But I already have it installed. So now if you would open up your Cypress window again, you will see that right here, you see we have the payment underscore spec.js file. And you can click right here on run one integration spec. Now it's important, at least I'm going to use the Electron environment, but you can also test this in like a Chrome or Edge environment, depending on which device you're using. But I will just click right here. And now you see that right here we have the describe with the name of the test, and it says no commands were issued in this test, which is right. So that's what we're going to take care of right now. So first of all, we want to log in, and the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the user, well, visits our app. So we can say cypress.visit, and the user will simply visit the root of our site. So now you'll see when I save the file, the test will automatically run, and there you will see we have our local host 3000. Seems to take a bit of time to actually load up, but there we have it. There we have our app. Awesome. So now we want to actually do the same thing as we did with the React testing library. So we want to make sure that the user types and maybe also hits that checkbox and clicks on sign in. So let's actually, and that's why we installed the, or at least I hope you installed the testing playground plugin. So I'll just open that up. So now you will see when I will click right here on this icon, select element. And now when I hover over this element, you will see it gives me a suggested query. It's the get by role text box name username, which is great. So I will copy this and I will paste it. Now, instead of saying screen, because we're using Cypress right now, we just want to use the Cypress command. And instead of saying get by role, in Cypress, everything will always be find by role, okay? Or find by, you know, could also be label text or find by placeholder text, but you can never target something by using get. You always have to use find. So the next thing we want to do right here is right now we target that text box and then we want to say dot type, and it will should enter right there John Doe. So now when I save it and I go back to Cypress, you will see it's actually going to execute this. So let's take care of all the other steps. So next up we have this field right here, and you see for some reason this one does have a label text suggested query, and that's simply because the password input field has a label to it and the username doesn't, right? So doesn't really matter. If you can target by label text, you should prefer that. So we'll say Cypress, find by label text, and then we will type the passwords, which will be secret. And then the user probably is going to check that remember me checkbox as well. So we'll grab this thing right here, copy. So right here we have Cypress, find by role, and then right here we can use check. So it's going to check that box, and then we want to click that button right here. Let's actually, I think it's not able to find it right now. Oops, made a typo right there. Now it is enabled. There we go. So get by role button, awesome. And then we can say it should click that. So of course this should also be Cypress, find by role. Let's save it and go back to Cypress and take a look what happens. Boom, there we go, we're logged in. And this is what I really like about, you know, end-to-end tests. It's super fast, and it's essentially like doing manual testing, like, you know, real browser testing, but then in an automated way, which is extremely valuable. So now the next step is to check the account balance. Now what you will see now when I will log in and use the testing playground tool, now when I hover right here over the account balance, you will see it gives us a get by role heading with the name of the, actually the account balance. But of course the account balance is dynamic. It can change from time to time. So this is not a good query. And unfortunately, as you can see right here, it's not giving us any other details as well. But Cypress also has this tool built in, you could say. And you can use it by going right here to saying open selector playground. And now I can select the amount, and you will see that it has a data test ID. And I can actually copy this, and I can look for it in our code base. Actually, let's take a look. Let's just do this site nav user balance, and you will see that this lives in the nav drawer. And what you see is that they attached a data test ID to this element right here. And I have to say, like, using a test ID is something you should use as a last resort. But especially in these kind of cases where the content can be dynamic, it's a very good way to target a specific element. And the reason I'm saying that, and why we are using the React testing library commands with Cypress, is that, the more your tests are, well, acting as how a user would use your app, the better. And a user will never go off by a test ID, right? And that's why we have right here, we have the find by role and find by label text, because that's actually how a user will look at our and interact with our application. But especially in cases like this, where you, for example, have like dynamic content, a data test ID is perfectly fine to use. So I'll just close this up. And the first thing I will do, I will assign a new variable, and I will call it, let's see, current balance, or let's actually do old balance, because later on we will also use the current balance. So I think it might be a little bit more clear to say that we first have the old balance and then grab the new balance. So now we want to store that value, of course. So what we can do is I will just copy this to my clipboard, and I'll say .then, and we will call this balance, for example. So I'll say balance, and then it's going to return it's going to set the old balance to the balance dot text. And now let's check what the value of old balance is. So I can say .then, and then we take the I don't know, balance, and return console.log balance. There we go. And you can also open up your console right here. So now you'll see the test is going to run. And there we go. The current balance is now console logged. But of course, we don't need that for now. So I will just remove that part and save it like that. So next up, we have click on pay button, but now we see it's actually new. So let's change that. And we can go back to our app right here, see if our testing playground has a suggested query, and it does. Get a role button, name new. Awesome. Copy that. Cypress, find by role button, and we want to click it. So we then want to search for a user. So, well, for example, let's say user, instead of immediately clicking on a user, also types. So we can do Devin Becker, right? So I'll grab this, grab a role text box. So, on this page, there's only one text box. So this query is fine to me. Oops. Cypress, find by role dot type, and we're going to look for Devin Becker, and then let's see, it's going to click on, well, let's do that actually, Devin Becker. You can see we only have one result. So then, well, the user is probably going to click on that name. So we can say get by text Devin Becker, which is, by the way, a query we haven't used before. But if the user is going to click on a certain piece of text and not necessarily a button, you can use this query. Find and say .click. So now let's run this test and see how it goes. Awesome, that works. So now let's move on to step 2 of the payment process. So we'll click right here, and then we want to target this right here. And now you see, and also testing playground, that extension is not always perfect because, well, you and I know that in the previous test we created, we were actually able to target these by get by placeholder text, but it seems that testing playground is not able to find a suggested query. So that's why we just have to type it ourselves right now. So we have Cypress find by what was it again? Find by placeholder text, and we want to look for amount, and then we want to type. And I recommend you in these kind of tests, you often want to work with like a test database, so you're not really making real transactions in this case. But also try to keep, if you're sending amounts or these kind of things, especially in your happy paths, try to keep keep those values low so you don't run into problems where you then have to reset the account balance or something like that, right? So I will copy this, and we also want to get the add a note. We're going to so now to make sure that we have like a unique note, because if I will add dinner right here, then if a user would go to their personal transactions right here, you will get like dinner everywhere, right? So we want to prevent that from happening. So what I can do is I can make sure we get like a unique node. So I'll say const v4 at, oops, that's the wrong import statement. So I have to use uuid v4 is require uuid, which is already installed into this project. And then we can use uuid v4 to create like a, well, not necessarily random, but a unique identifier. Okay, so it's a const note is uuid v4. So now I can grab that node, and instead of saying dinner, put it in here. And now when I save this and I go back to Cypress, you will see that it's going to add that node. Yep, so there you go. There we have our unique ID. The next thing the user will do is, of course, click on that pay button. So let's actually see if we can get a suggested query for that as well. So I will copy this. Cypress find by role dot click, and that should bring us to the next page. And then the user should click on, or in this case, we decided that the user will click on return to transactions. So we again have a suggested query dot click Cypress find by role. So next up, the user will go to their personal payment. So of course they've clicked right here, and then we'll click on this. I'm not sure if it's a button. Let's see. Get by role, tap. Okay. Copy that. Dot click. Find by role. And then we will have the click on payment. So of course, then the user, for example, could click on the text of the note they added to the actual payment. So we could do a get by text query. But of course, in this case, we're not going to grab this, but we're going to grab the note we created, Cypress find by text dot click. And well, let's actually run this test, see if everything is still working. Now, as you can see, we have an error. So let's take a look. It says timeout retrying after 4 seconds. Cypress.click failed because this element is being covered by another element. And as you can see, indeed, that element right here, our last transaction, is covered by the header. And that's why it's not working. So I'm not too much concerned about this, because something you could do, for example, is scroll this element into view. So there's this thing called scroll into view, which could also work, but not in this case, because it takes some time for the page to load. And Cypress, like by default, is constantly looking for the element you're trying to target. And as soon as it finds it, it's going to click or type or, execute whatever you asked Cypress to do. And because, this is not really working properly, because when I go right here to the, let's take a look right here, try to click. And as you can see, the list did not completely load yet proper. At least I think that's the cause of this. And that's why you have like a sort of layout shift in the page. Now, I'm personally not too much concerned about this, right? So, of course, usually you want to test how a real user would use your application, but I can show you that if we would use this in the browser right here. So let's make a new payment. Call it Peaches, and click on Pay, return to transactions. And then when I now click on mine, you will see I will just perfectly see it. So I'm not too concerned about scrolling into the view. So I will just force Cypress to click on the element, even though it's well, kind of like hidden below another element. And we can do that by using force true. And as you can see right now, it works. So right here, we probably want to check for two things. We want to check if the right node is on this page and the right payment amount. So what we can do is, instead of saying that we type 5, we can actually make a variable out of this. It's of course not necessary, but I like it because we can then reuse it. So I will say const payment amount is string 5.00, and then instead of doing like a hard-coded string, we're going to pass the variable to it. And right here, verify if the payment was made. We can go back to the real browser, so to speak, and let's take a look if it's the testing playground is able to help us out. So we get a query get by text. So say Cypress dot get by text, but right here, I want to check if like and we can use string interpolation for that, if the minus $, and then we want to have the payment amount, right? So payment amount, and then we want to check if this is actually visible, so on the page. So we can say should, and this is different compared to the React testing library, right? The way we make assertions. But in order to check for this, we can check for this to be visible. And we can do the same thing for the node, right? So, oops, copy this, and then right here we just want to check for the node should be visible. Perfect. Let's save it and take a look at the outcome. Yep, and I made a typo right there because of course this, instead of get, should be find. So let's save it. And now you can see in the bottom left corner that we have made 2 successful assertions. So now the last step is to check whether the account balance, or actually the payment amount, has been deducted from the account balance. So that's probably the most difficult one, because the string we stored, like the where is it, the old balance right here, this is actually the string including the dollar and the comma. So we have to replace that by a regex. So well, we can essentially target the same element. So I will grab this thing right here, copy it. All right, so we want to take the balance, but then instead of doing this, we are going to create new variable. So let's say const converted old balance, and this is going to be the old balance dot replace. And right here we want to replace the $, and we want to replace the comma, and we want to do that globally by an empty string. And we also want to grab that new balance, so this will be converted new balance, and then we will grab the balance, right? So what we get passed from the element we targeted, and then we have to first convert that to text. That's really important, otherwise it won't work. And now I'm thinking about this, we need to actually parse float this stuff right here. So say parse float, and do the same for the one right here. Perfect. So now we want to check whether the difference between the new and old balance is equal to the payment amount. So we can make a custom assertion. So I can say expect converted new balance minus the converted old balance, or actually I have to swap that around, of course. There we go. To equal, and then we take parse float the payment amount. Okay, that should be it. Let's save it and take a look what Cypress has to say. Yep, there we have it. Another typo. Invalid chai property to be. Did you mean to? Of course, I needed to have to right here and not to be. Let's try it again. Yes, there we go. 3 successful assertions. Expected 5 to equal 5. And of course, if you remember, our payment amount was 5. So there you have it, your first end-to-end test. And I have to tell you that this is, quite a large end-to-end test, but you see there's a lot of repetition going on, right? So you have a lot of times you just have to target elements, type something, clicking, but that's, that's simply how users would use, well, applications and websites in general. So yeah, let's wrap things up. And I think this is the most important part of the video, because now we're going to put things into context. First of all, always remember why we write tests. We want to check if our app behaves as expected. Testing simply costs time, and for companies it costs money. So make sure you have some priorities in your testing strategy so you can get most bang for your buck. My testing priority list I showed you before is an example of that, right? And it just gives you some guidance in your testing workflow. Very often you will find that your high value features are best to be tested with at least some end-to-end tests using tools like Cypress. For most of the other things, you usually can simply use integration or unit tests to test them as well. But keep in mind what I said before. If you find yourself running a lot of small unit tests, try to see if you maybe can combine some of those unit tests. And of course, the goal there should be to, make a test that better resembles how a user would use your application. Just try to find the right testing tool for the right problem. And it's up to you as a developer or testing expert to decide upon that. And especially with regard to the different types of tests, because you should know that there are also other ways of testing your application, for example, through a combination of static tests or manual regression tests. You have seen that the lines between especially unit and integration tests are, very fine. And, don't fixate too much on the actual, definition of what it actually means. Because like I said before, in the community, there's a lot of people that disagree what a unit or an integration test is. But in the end, the definitions, it doesn't really matter as long as you're ensuring that your tests are acting as a safeguard against unwanted behavior in your apps. And of course, in this video, I wasn't able to cover everything that is, part of testing. You also have things like mocking and, lots of different things. But I think if you understand what we've done in this video, you are very well underway in your testing journey. If you'd like to see more about React, testing, JavaScript, or my life as a web developer, feel free to check out my YouTube channel. Thanks so much for staying with me, and I hope you liked it and now feel you have some good tools to start testing your React applications. And also, Brad, thanks again so much for letting me create a video for your awesome channel. Having that said, if you have any questions, let me know down in the comments. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.